The last week, Torah described in great detail a major rebellion that took place. 12 scouts, and sent to surveying the land. Read that report. 10 of the 12 brought back a very negative report. And they clearly stated that this land is not capable of being conquered. We're going to be defeated. And as a result, the Jews in the desert started to cry and expressing the desire not to see the promised land. And God says, we get what they're asking for. You will all die in the desert, and their children to see the land. This was a major rebellion. A few weeks before that, we read about another rebellion. The rebellion of the golden calf, where they demanded to have a substitute, a replacement for Moses, who they thought was not going to return. Moses was up on the mount 40 days and 40 nights, and they miscalculated what he was supposed to return. And they created this golden calf. That was a major rebellion against God. And this week, we're going to read about a third rebellion. There are other small rebellions in between. Rebellion against the manna. People were sick and tired of the manna from heaven. And other smaller acts of rebelliousness. Here it was a major rebellion of Moses' cousin, his first cousin, Korach, very distinguished member of the Jewish community, started a rebellion against Moses. He, together with the two arch-villains, Dasan and Aviro, these were two troublemakers who were always causing trouble from even before the Exodus, together with 250 prominent leaders from the tribe of Reuven. So this was a major rebellion in which the Torah says they gathered up against Moses and Aaron, and they said, you're taking too much power. The entire community, they're all holy. God is within them. Why do you raise yourself above everyone else? Why do you exalt yourself? And that's the end of the story was that Korach and his cohorts were swallowed up in the earth. This was a terrible rebellion. Now, before we get into the details of the rebellion itself, why they rebelled, you get the impression when you read the Torah, this is the way most people have it register. It seems that the people were all these horrible people, and all they do is rebel. Because, like the media, but for different reasons, the Torah focuses on the negative. The Torah doesn't focus on the good things they did. Now, how long were they in the desert? 40 years. In the 40 years, there were a few rebellions. Most of the rebellions, this took place in the first 2 years, and a little bit of the last year. In between, you had 38 years where there's no rebellion. So they must have been doing things right. Because if they were doing things wrong, the Torah would have mentioned. Why does the Torah highlight the negatives? Because the Torah is not here just to promote its heroes. Torah is here to point out the frailties of the human being and how we have to correct those mistakes. Torah is not a history book. Torah has a lot of history in it, but it's not a history book. It's not here to teach us history. It's here to teach us how to live our lives. And if the Torah would just tell us all the details of the daily life of the people, it would teach us that much. So it focuses on the faults, and not only focuses on them, but highlights them and puts them under a microscope. And no matter how good the people were, the Torah will highlight their negatives as a way of emphasizing the importance of working on ourselves, so that to emphasize the positive would not give us that lesson, would not help us. So I just wanted to mention that by way of introduction. Here. That for the fact that we're reading every week about another rebellion doesn't mean that that's all the people did. In fact, the generation of the 40 years they were in the desert is characterized as Dor Deya, a generation of knowledge. These people were on the highest level of spiritual knowledge. And that's why the Torah was given to them, because in order for people to really embrace and absorb the spiritual lessons of the Torah, they had to be
Recording in progress.
They had to be at a high spiritual level. And they were at a high spiritual level. And in fact, that was the reason for the rebellion. Sometimes you do things wrong because you're a very low person. Sometimes you do things wrong because you're a very high person, operating at a higher, more sophisticated level. What was the sophistication? The people wanted to stay in the desert so they could devote themselves totally to a spiritual existence. They wouldn't have to fight wars. They wouldn't have to work on the agriculture. They wouldn't have to struggle to make a living. They had everything supplied to them. The manna came from heaven. The clothing grew with them. It was laundered with them. They were protected from their enemies with the clouds of glory, deflected any arrows. They didn't have to worry about wild animals, snakes and scorpions. The clouds got rid of them. They didn't have to climb high hills and mountains. They were all leveled. All these miracles that happened in the desert, they all facilitated their ability to focus on the spiritual ideals of life. They didn't have to worry about the physical world, the material world. So they were very sophisticated people, but because of their sophistication, they rebelled. God says, I'm not interested in your sophistication. I'm interested in you building a land and establishing a physical existence that is in conformance with God's plan and mission. God does not want, if God wanted spiritual people, he had plenty of angels. Angels are spiritual beings. God says, I don't need angels. I use them, but that's not my purpose in creating the universe. I created the universe because I wanted human beings, with all their frailties, with all their faults, with all their limitations, should struggle with their evil impulses and with all the negative, and resist the negative, and generate positive energy and make the physical world a dwelling place for God, a place that God feels comfortable dwelling within. It's like you have a house and you're expecting a very honored guest. What do you do to the house? You make sure the house is built right, and you make sure that the house is clean and the house is decorated, it has the right furniture. And that's the same way God wants us to create a world that is inviting to God, that God feels comfortable living and dwelling in that. So that was the lesson that the people of the rebellion against going into the promised land, that was the lesson for them. So you can sometimes be in a very high level and be tested because you could make mistakes. Some of the greatest people, because they were not in spite of their greatness, but because of their greatness, could do things that are wrong. Sometimes when you're promoted to a very high level, the power can go to your head and you make decisions based on your own understanding and not realizing that that's not consistent with God's will. But now we got to a new rebellion. Korach. He rebels against Moses. He didn't like the fact that Moses and Aaron had positions of power. He sounds like the first communist by saying, everyone is holy. God is within everyone. Why are you higher than everyone else? That's exactly what communism espoused. Everyone is equal, except the leaders are a little bit more or a lot more equal than everyone else. Communism, of course, was one of the most evil ideologies in all of human history.
and second only to Nazism, because the idea of communism is to, first of all, deny God's role in everything. That's the political sense of communism, that we have to get rid of religion. Although you could argue that communism doesn't have to be atheistic, but it always turns out to be that way. But besides that, the idea that everyone is equal is such a fallacy, is so wrong. We're not all equal, and we should not aspire to be all equal. No, all of existence depends on a recognition that there are different functions and different roles, and every human being has his or her unique role, and they're not all the same. Also, the idea of communism, that the government takes care of all your needs, is not consistent with Jewish values. Because if the government takes care of your needs, then there's no need for me to help my neighbor. Why do I have to give charity? Why should I take what I earn and give to someone else? That person is in need, the government takes care of it. So it weans people off the idea of kindness. There's a biblical expression, the world was created with kindness and created for kindness, that human beings should be kind to one another. But if you have a government system, you have an automatic system that does the kindness for you, then your role is pointless. What am I doing here? I don't have to be kind. I don't have to relate to others and express kindness and compassion to others. Then what's my function? What's my role in this world? Why did God create me? So, there's much more to discuss about how Judaism and communism are totally antithetical to one another. But this seems to be what Korach's argument was, that everyone is equal, and therefore Moses and Aaron, you shouldn't be higher than everyone else. The hypocrisy in Korach's argument was that he himself aspired to be the leader. He wanted to be the high priest. So, and he's saying that everyone could be a leader, except I think I'm better equipped to be a leader than everyone else. But the question that is asked is, this occurred soon after the other rebellion. And the people knew that the ones who rebelled, the spies were all killed in a plague. All the men who cried that night because they didn't want to go to see the land, all died in the desert. So how could a man of the stature of Korach, the wisdom of Korach, how could he start a rebellion? Didn't he realize that it was ill-fated, that it was not going to turn out good? Why would he think that he was doing the right thing? That's a very basic question commentators ask. And one very powerful answer is, human beings sometimes are like pendulums. A pendulum swings from one extreme to the other. And one of the big challenges of life is that when you go to one extreme and you realize it's bad, people tend to go to the other extreme, which is equally bad. But that's human nature, that we want to correct something we did wrong, so we go to the other extreme. And you don't find the right balance. As I mentioned in many classes, much of Judaism is directed to balance. Extremes, sometimes you have to go to an extreme, obviously. War is an extreme. Wars are terrible. We don't want to fight wars, but sometimes you have to fight a war. Sometimes you have to destroy a nuclear reactor. Sometimes you have to use violence. King Solomon says it's a time for war, a time for peace. But that's only in an emergency, extenuating circumstances. Generally speaking, you have to have the right balance. So what happens over here is Korach took the lesson from the spies and went and swung to the opposite direction. In what way? In the way we serve God, there are two dimensions. There's the spiritual and the physical. The physical represents the actions that we do. When you perform an act of charity, that's a physical act. Let's say someone is poor and in need, and I help that person, but I don't have any feelings in that performance of that mitzvah. I still get the credit for it. I still help the other person. My intentions are not that important for the poor person. The poor person who's starving says, give me that sandwich. I don't care how you feel about it. I'm hungry. The spirituality is secondary when it comes to doing an act of a mitzvah, whatever the mitzvah may be, whatever the biblical commandment may be. But then there's also a spiritual dimension. So what happened in the first rebellion, the one of the spies, is that the people focused on and were obsessed with the spiritual dimension. They wanted to stay in the desert where they would not be able to, and they would not need to do anything physical. There was no need to give charity. Who are you giving charity to? Everyone had the same amount of food. Everyone had the same shelter. Everyone had everything. And they had plenty. There was really no need to manifest their devotion to God through physical actions. It was mostly spiritual, study, meditation, reflection. And when that was proven to be wrong, that God says, no, I want the physical. I'm not interested in that spiritual focus. Korach took that to the other extreme, that the spiritual is irrelevant. And if the spiritual is irrelevant, you don't need a hierarchy of higher levels. When it comes to the physical, everyone is equal. Does it make a difference if you're at a very high spiritual level and you help someone, or you're in a low spiritual level and you help someone? The help is the same. So Korach said, based on the lesson we just learned from the debacle of the spies, that God is not interested in the spiritual, at least that's how he interpreted it, then what's important only is the physical. And when it comes to the physical, we're all equal. So Moses, why do we need a leader like Moses? Why do we need a spiritual leader? Why do you need an Aaron, a spiritual leader like Aaron? We're all equal. Yes, you need a manager. In every society, you need someone to manage things. But that's only a technical type of leadership, not a spiritual, hierarchical leadership. And that's what Korach said, and he was sincere in that belief, thinking that was the lesson from the spies, that we don't focus on the physical, we don't focus on the spiritual, we focus on the physical. But he was wrong about that, because God wanted the balance. He wanted both. He doesn't want us to eliminate the spiritual dimension and role. He wants us primarily, of course, for the physical, to make the world a divine place by doing physical things that are godly. But he also wants us to instill the physical actions with spiritual feelings, with fervor, with enthusiasm, with deeper understanding, with the ability to go probe beneath the surface, to know the spiritual aspect of it, to get to the spirit of the mitzvah, of the commandment, not just the body of it. Now, if you have a choice of meditating on helping someone or helping them without meditating, you help the person regardless of how little you appreciate the value of what you're doing, because the physical thing is what's crucial. But it's a lifeless action. And God wants us to put life, instill life in everything we do. We shouldn't just be doing it mechanically, but by rote. We should do it with feeling. Korach missed that point. He thought that the lesson of the spies was to go to the opposite direction and just focus on the physical. And in that case, there's really no need for a spiritual hierarchy of people who are at a higher spiritual level. But that was not God's intention. Now, Korach, to go a little deeper into it, the word Korach has a meaning. Korach is related to a word that means bald. If a man is bald, what does that mean? It means he has hair on both sides, but there's a baldness in between. There's a separation. Korach was a separator. He was a divider. He was a person who fought for division. He started, whenever you start a rebellion, you're creating a division between people. And that was Korach's nature. He was a divider. But it goes deeper than that. The ultimate goal of the Torah is to synthesize the heaven and earth, to bring heaven and earth together. On day 2 of creation, God separates between the waters above and the waters below. God creates the concept of separation. But the ultimate goal of that separation is to bring unity. And that's what the Torah was. The Torah is the essence of unity, bringing the heavenly and the earthly together. They should not be at odds with each other. Korach was trying to undermine that synthesis, that unity. Korach was about separation. And it manifested itself in three ways. And the three ways correspond to the very name of Korach, the way it's spelled in Hebrew. If you know Hebrew letters, there's a letter Hey. The letter Hey is formed by a horizontal line on top, a vertical line on the right side, and another vertical line on the left, which doesn't reach the top. There's like a space between the vertical line and the top horizontal line. That's how the letter Hey is formed. The letter Hey is a very important letter because the Talmud tells us that when God created the world, He created it with the letters of His name. And this physical world He created with the letter Hey. Now, the letter Hey has three lines, as I just said. There's a horizontal line at top, a vertical line on one side, and another vertical line on the other side. And there are three ways you could distort the letter Hey and turn it into three other letters. One way of distorting it is by leaving the left vertical line, which is dangling because it doesn't touch the top, to eliminate it, to drop it altogether. Then that turns into the letter Resh. The Hebrew letter Resh, which has a horizontal line and a vertical line, just one vertical line. So if you get rid of the left leg of the Hey, it turns into a Resh. Another thing you can do is, if you take the left leg of the Hey and you stretch it out, you make it longer, it turns to the letter Kuf, like a K. Resh is like an R. The third thing you can do to it is, if you take the left vertical line, which is dangling, but you attach it to the roof, it turns into a letter Ches. In English, there's no Ches. Ches is a guttural sound, a Ch sound. So the letter Hey can be corrupted in three different ways. The Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the greatest Jewish leader, showed and demonstrated that Korach actually attempted in three ways to corrupt the letter Hey, which is the source of divine energy in this world. Because the letter Hey, with the three lines, encompass the three areas in which human beings express themselves. The line on top represents machshava, thought. The mind. The right line, the vertical line on the right, represents speech, which takes the thought and brings it out. It expresses your thoughts. The thoughts are above. No one knows what is another person's thoughts until they express themselves. But then you also have on the left, you have action. So those are the three, and the goal of Judaism is that you should fill your thoughts, your speech, and actions with holy ideals. But you can corrupt that in three different ways. So let's go in order. Now, the word Korach is spelled with the letter Kuf. Kuf is where you take the left leg and you extend it downward. What does that symbolize? Action. That symbolizes exaggerating the action, being too physical. Some people will like to live their lives very, very physical and not consistent with the thought and speech. Now, it doesn't mean you shouldn't be too charitable. That's not what it means. It means you shouldn't be too involved with the physical world, letting the physical world define you, and becoming less spiritual. So that's the first thing that Korach did. The first thing Korach did was to exaggerate the value of the physical. And again, as I said before, he learned the lesson from the spies that God didn't like the idea that they didn't want to be physical. They wanted to remain spiritual. So Korach said, okay, so I'll be very physical and very focused on and obsessed with the physical material world. So that turns the Hey into the letter Kuf. And then Korach says, well, if God doesn't like the physical, if he's not happy with what I just did, then I'm going to drop the physical altogether and let it dangle. And not let it dangle anymore and let it drop. And that turns into a Resh, which is the second letter of Korach's name. Now, the third distortion is, so the first distortion is where you exaggerate the role of action. The second distortion is where you eliminate, you go to the opposite extreme, the pendulum swings to the opposite direction, and you get rid of action. No, actually, God, you're not happy with my actions? You're not happy with my preoccupation with the material world? Okay, I'll throw it out altogether. That's not right. The letter Resh in Hebrew, every letter in Hebrew has three things to it. It has its shape, it has the way we pronounce it, and has its translation. Resh means poverty. A person who doesn't have action, who doesn't have material existence, is poor, is deficient. So Korach went from one extreme, the Kuf. By the way, the word Kuf is related to a word in Hebrew which means an ape. What's an ape? An ape could do everything a human being does. In apes, in English, the word ape means to mimic. A monkey mimics. It's action, but it's not action based on wisdom. It's just action. It has no real substance to it. So that's the Kuf. The Resh is poverty. Now, if that's not if Korach says, if God is not happy with that, what I'll do is I'll make action equal to thought and speech by extending the left line, the vertical line, to reach the roof. What does that mean? That I'm going to show how I don't need I don't have to look up to the spiritual anymore. Because that's what the Hey represents, where there's a space above the line, the left vertical line, that represents the idea that I look up to something higher than me. Korach was saying, no one is higher than anyone else. We're all equal. So when you say that, you're taking the left leg, which represents action, and you're saying it's equal to the person on top. We're all equal. And that's not true. We have to recognize that we're not all equal, and we have to relate to someone who's more spiritual than we are. That's why Judaism has the idea of every person has to have a spiritual mentor, someone that you look up to, even though when it comes to the physical actions, we're all the same. We might all be the same, but you have to recognize there's a hierarchy. There's someone who's higher than you. You have to show respect and reverence for a Moses, for an Aaron, and other great people. And there are so many different levels, and we all have to aspire to get to a higher level. That it's not just the physical that counts. So Korach did this threefold rebellion. Number one, he said, let's take the physical and maximize it, and exaggerate it, and drag it down like a monkey, just doing action without thought. And that's no good. Well, let me get rid of action. If you don't like action, we'll throw out the dangling leg of the hay. And if you think that's not good, you want action, but you don't want too much action, then we'll accept the idea of action, but no need for a spiritual hierarchy where I have to look up to someone that there's a gap between me and the person above me. In other words, a ches represents there's no gap. We're all equal. The hay represents we're not all equal. There's a gap between me and the next person. I have to appreciate the higher level of the next person and try to learn from that person. So that's what Korach was all about. Korach was about he had a problem with the left leg of the hay. Now, it's another point. There's a midrash as a collection of rabbinic teachings, Talmudic period, which says Korach was so smart. What did he see? What did he see that allowed him to start a rebellion? A smart person knows that you start up with fire, you get burnt. People got burnt because of their rebellions of the past. So what did Korach see? So there are different versions of the answer. One version is he looked into the future. He was a visionary. Korach was not an insignificant person. He was a very powerful, spiritual person. And he saw that one of his descendants will be the prophet Samuel, who in the book of Psalms is compared to Moses and Aaron. That means that he combined the qualities of both Moses and Aaron. So he said, if I'm going to have descendants like that, then I'm certainly not going to be punished. That means I'm going to survive. Well, he didn't realize that his children survived, and they were the ancestors of Shmuel. He died. He was thrown into the pit and perished there. So sometimes you could look into the future, and you could even think you're a prophet, but you have no way of really knowing how it's going to materialize. You don't base your actions on the future. You base your actions about what God says about what you should do right now. And don't make calculations of the future. There's a similar theme much earlier in the Torah, when Joseph was a slave in the house of Potiphar, one of the ministers in Egypt. And Potiphar's wife tried to seduce Joseph. Why was she so intent on seducing Joseph? So again, she looked into the future, and she had some prophetic power. She saw that she's going to bear a child from Joseph. That Joseph will be the father of her child. She had it, so it was not just a temptation of physical temptation, it was a spiritual thing, that she saw prophetically that she's going to bear a child through Joseph. And she wasn't wrong. She was partially wrong. Because who did Joseph marry? Joseph married her daughter, Osnas, mentioned in the Torah. And she had 2 sons. So Joseph did, in fact, bear children through Potiphar's wife, but not through her personally, but through her daughter. So sometimes people, that's the difference between real prophets and not real prophets, fortune tellers. There is a concept that God allows certain people to have premonitions about the future. Some people, we all have premonitions at one time or another, and they turn out to be accurate. But the difference between a premonition and a prophet is really revealing what God told him, and he can never be wrong. But people who have premonitions, even though they might be prescient, they can see the future, but there's always something a little bit inaccurate about their predictions. We find many examples of that that I won't go into right now. So Korach looked into the future, and he saw that things will be shining and great. But he was wrong, because it didn't apply to him. It was his children who repented before they were swallowed up. And they were the ones who eventually fathered a line of people who would ultimately lead to Prophet Samuel, who was so great. Now Moses, when they started this rebellion, Moses says to the people, let's wait till the morning. Let's wait till the morning. And then we'll see who God has chosen and who God has not chosen. Why did he ask to wait for the morning? So Rashi, the primary commentator, said, at night, people had their meal. In those days, the people would drink wine. and you're not thinking clearly. So he said, let's wait till the morning. That was a pretext. He wanted to wait till the morning, hoping that maybe at night they'll reflect on what they were doing and they will repent. When you see someone doing something wrong, don't punish them right away, or don't force them into realizing they do wrong by punishment. Give them an opportunity to repent. That's one explanation Rashi gives. But there's another explanation. And the other one is that day and night are separated. In the very beginning of creation, the very first day, God creates the light, and he separates between light and darkness. And the light is day and the darkness is night. It didn't have to be that way, but God created that there's an idea of separation. By the same token, Moses was trying to tell him there are certain separations in existence that we have to respect. The separation between light and darkness. There's a separation between good and evil. And there's a separation even within goodness. There are different levels. There's the high priest, there's the regular Kohen, a priest, and there is the leader. There are so many different categories. There's the Kohen, and the Jewish community is divided up basically into three divisions. The highest is the Kohen, the priest, then there's the Levi, the Levite, who's the attendant to the priest, the auxiliary to the priest. And then you have Yisrael, the average Jew. Now, it's true that these divisions are not so total and not absolute, because a king can only be a Yisrael, the lowest level. A priest cannot be a king in Judaism. A Levite cannot be a king, only at Yisrael. But nevertheless, there are different divisions and spiritual divisions. And just like we have to respect the divisions between day and night, we have to respect the divisions that exist between one category and another. And therefore, your whole argument that we're all equal is a false argument, because we're not all equal. We're not supposed to be all equal. We have to respect the differences that exist between us. In Judaism, we have laws of separation in many areas. We're not supposed to have milk and meat together. We have to separate between milk and meat. We're not allowed to plant grain in a vineyard. We're not allowed to wear a garment that's made out of wool and linen. These are a few other such commandments that demand separation. Judaism also believes in unification and synthesis. Love your fellow as yourself. Even though we're totally different people, we have to associate with one another. So the Judaism is again the balance between division and unification. And if you take the division too far, it's no good. If you take the unification too far, it's no good.